Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today we're gonna do something a little bit different. We are gonna react to this article, which I only found the other day, even though it was published already a while ago, and it's titled SWTOR's PvP is burning to the ground. Wow. But yeah, clickbait headline out of the way, we're gonna go through what it says, because I think the article actually has some interesting points and also some that I don't really agree with at all. So we're gonna go over it, and I'm gonna give you my thoughts on the current state of the game, let's say. And maybe some suggestions what Broadsword should do to improve it. So first thing basically he's saying is that the removal of ranked PvP has only played a small part, but things wouldn't be too different if somehow ranked was still in the game. And with that, I personally don't agree. I think even though ranked had a relatively small player base, I myself didn't play ranked in the last years anymore. I still think when you look at Twitch, those people that were streaming solo ranked consistently got really high viewer numbers. Viewer numbers that nowadays you pretty much only see from out of category streamers, so people that already have a bigger audience and then they decide to stream SWTOR. So while the community was small, it gave the people that wanted to play in a more competitive way an outlet for that, and simply removing it with the argument that they made that it would be hard to do or non-compatible with the 7.0 dual class system that they introduced, so the combat style system. I think it's just simply a little bit lazy. I think the real reasons to remove that was, first of all, that I guess the part of the player base that was interested in ranked was relatively small compared to the people that play the game for the space Barbie aspect and maybe the cuddle market, or even PvE for that matter. So from a cost versus benefit perspective for BioWare, now Broadsword, maybe did not make sense to invest too much into ranked, right? So update the leaderboards, keep producing those rewards, but I still think it was a mistake because you could have figured out some way to fix the leaderboard. Maybe you could have had 2 different ratings depending on your combat style, or you could have simply rated all players and changed the way that the top 3 titles worked. So not give out those top 3 platinum flares for the top 3 players of a combat style, but just give it to the best, I guess would be 96 players, or maybe make it top 100 in the world or something. Or the top 20 ranked players on a server, right? That would have worked as well. But nevertheless, they decided to remove it. I think it was a big mistake because it gives players that want to play competitive, it takes the option of having something to work towards away, right? So they introduced the non-ranked arenas, which I think is great. People can practice arenas in order to not jump into ranked directly as a first-time player. But in the same patch when they introduced that, they removed ranked arenas. So yeah, now if you're a player that is playing the game, pretty much the only thing you can do at the moment is play it casually. And if you want to play it more competitively, right, maybe you're coming from World of Warcraft and you want to try out this game, you find out there is no ranked, there are no rewards for competitive play, for kind of showing off your skill and showing off how good you are, then yeah, those players will just quit the game, which actually makes the other problems that are talked about in the article, such as a non-working matchmaking, worse. So yeah, long ramble, but I think removing ranked was definitely a poor decision. Folks working on this game aren't lazy, they're just underfunded. Well, that's arguable. I don't know them personally, maybe they're not lazy, but I definitely think they have the wrong priorities in my opinion, especially looking at the focus on pastries and dancing in the latest update 7.5 that they announced. Has to do with the greedy money man at EA that everyone loves to hate. Sure, so he's basically saying what I tried to say earlier. The game is an MMORPG, so there are a lot of things. There are people that enjoy it for PvP. There are people that enjoy it for operations, maybe flashpoints, or maybe just the role-playing aspect of that, and that's fine. But of course, a developer with limited resources will have to focus those resources on improving one aspect of the game, or maybe 2, but you cannot, I guess, focus on all of them. Because typically how it works, when you develop a game like this, there was definitely a team of over 100 people working on the game. And once it launched, a lot of those resources will usually be scaled back and move on to other projects. And then typically the resources that you have to continue developing a product are, usually less than what was put into it when you first developed the project. And I guess in this case, it's not different. Of course, Star Wars: The Old Republic, famously, I think at the time was the most expensive game ever made with all the voice acting and such. But still, as I said in the article, at the time of Legacy of the Sith being developed, so the latest expansion, there were still 80 people directly working on the game. And, based on the move to broadsword, I guess more than half have moved over. So whether there's 40 or 80 people still working on the game, that's still a lot of people. I don't know how many of those 80 people would be technical, but let's say it's 20 or 30 people that are actually doing development work. That is a big team. And with a team like that, for sure, you can do some improvements. If we look at what they have changed in PvP, looking at new content, new maps, new game modes, new anything, there wasn't really anything there since 7.2 released, with the PvP Battle Pass. So yeah, I'm not sure if I agree with this whole thing of, the folks aren't lazy, they are just underfunded. I think they definitely have enough resources, they are just not spending it on PvP because they decided they don't give a fuck about PvP. They brought out the PvP seasons, the Battle Pass system that just rewards basically people grinding out matches, whether they win or lose. And they developed a system that they can easily maintain from season to season without having to put any development effort into that. So you just copy paste, you change the rewards a little. I think in the next season we will get Warzone Med Packs and Adrenals as rewards, which is maybe great for someone that has never played the game. But having played this game, since it launched, I have probably, 10,000 med packs lying around on my different characters. And so the rewards are also just a little bit lazy. So for me, to be honest, I completely ignore the PvP seasons. They don't give anything to me that I care about. But let's continue with the article. So what's the problem? When it comes to SWTOR PvP, there have always been problems. Well, yes, that is true. But the current state of PvP is unprecedented. And he says the main problem is there's just, people have quit. Number of players is dropped so low like never before. And you always have to look at the perspective of a writer. I think in this case, I went through the comments on this article and the guy was saying that he plays on Satil Shan. So of course the situation is different on other servers. Personally, I think on Darth Malgus at least. In the evenings when I play, the queues are still relatively fast. If you're queuing as a premade, you will usually play against another premade. And having played this game since launch with some breaks in between, I can definitely remember where the game was, similarly dead. And for sure I can remember also many times when the queues were way faster and the matches were better. But I wouldn't say it's at the worst state it has ever been. Okay, so what are the reasons of that happening? Unbalanced roles, an inconsiderate matchmaker. Roles are too unbalanced to the extent that some roles have far greater impact on the outcome of a match than others. Okay, so you can have a Warzone where one team has 2 healers and 6 DPS, and the other team has 2 tanks and 6 DPS. I don't know about that one. I think actually in those cases that he mentions here, the game is pretty balanced because 2 healers and 6 DPS can definitely lose to 2 tanks and 6 DPS just because of how powerful tanks are. And if the healers don't really know what they're doing, especially since those healers don't have a guard, then with 6 DPS and 2 tanks, you can have so much damage that the 2 healers cannot do anything about it. So I'm not sure I agree with this one. But in general, when it comes to the roles, I would definitely say that healers could use a buff. They are way less powerful right now compared to previous expansions. Because nowadays, unless the healer is really good, with many classes you could solo kill a heal. And back in the day, in earlier expansions, that definitely was not possible. It was maybe sometimes possible at the time when Hatred Sin was really overpowered for single target, but normally 1 DPS on their own should not be able to kill a proper healer, even without guard. But nowadays a good heal maybe does 20k HPS, maybe a little bit more, and a good DPS can almost do the same. So basically 1 DPS offsets 1 healer, and if you have 6 DPS on a team, you can immediately see that 2 healers will never be able to keep their team alive versus the DPS pressure of 6 DPS, especially if they also have 2 skank tanks on the other team. So in my opinion, if anything, they should buff heals and nerf tanks because tanks are too strong, but more on that later. Both of these issues are infuriating on their own, but they work together and problem is even worse. Warzone maps are objective-based, are they? And many of them are heavily reliant on one team wiping out the defense for just long enough to cap the objective and then hold it. Yes. Okay, so basically what he's saying, tanks are surviving too long even without a healer, and that's why it's hard to cap objectives. And I would agree with that, especially if you play against a PowerTech or Vanguard tank. If they are full defense, then it takes basically all your team to kill them, and even then they can live for 30 seconds or something like this. They are for sure long enough until the rest of the team respawns. But if you add to that there are things in the game like 2 cloaks, and you maybe have an assassin tank that's full def, you're never going to kill that guy, because with full defensive gear and Well, actually 3 stealths, because he's going to be defending the node in stealth as you're running there to cap it. He's going to zap you a couple of times, and then only when you're white barred and you cap again does he have to come out of stealth, pop all his cooldowns, survives for a minute or something, and then he can vanish and, you know, simply regen somewhere while his team has enough time to reinforce the node. So compared to earlier expansions, let me tell you, that was not the thing. You could definitely, first of all, find people in stealth, which they made now almost impossible, and you could also kill people faster than nowadays. And there was no such thing as, you know, 2 cloaks where people have 2 vanishes. They fixed some of the things that were overpowered defensively, like they nerfed the Defel Splice Jeans tactical that Marauder and Sentinel used to have. But 2 cloaks, I'm sorry, it needs to be nerfed because it's too strong and makes it impossible to play objectives in maps such as Hypergate or especially Voidstar if the defenders know what they're doing. At the same time, healer survivability is heavily reliant on guard, as they have fewer DCDs to mitigate the more concentrated burst that is far more ubiquitous now. Okay, so I think actually the issue with healers is not that defensive cooldowns are not strong enough. I mean, maybe the only healer that needs a buff to defensives is the Operative, but if you look at Sorc heal or especially Mercenary heal, they have some of the best cooldowns in the game. The problem is that damage is tuned really high and healing is tuned really low. So once those healers run out of cooldowns, if they don't have guard, then they simply cannot out-heal 2 DPS, or sometimes even 1 DPS if, you know, it's maybe a PowerTech with cooldowns up. So you need to buff HPS, and that way you could nerf other things in the game and still have healers feeling like they have an impact, like they can actually keep their team alive. Because right now, the few times that I played healers, it's, you know, you definitely feel like yourself, you can survive very well even without a guard, but your teammates will just die because there's so much DPS in the game. So yeah, don't quite agree with this one. Unfortunately, tanks aren't always present in the match. Well, in my opinion, that's good, but this guy probably mains heal based on how he writes. So what is he suggesting? It's appalling that the matchmaker still doesn't require matches to have the same team composition in terms of equal numbers of each role on the team. I'm not sure if that's true. I think the game actually tries to do that, but if there are simply not enough people in queue that are playing tank, so let's say you queue for arenas and there are 2 tanks, a bunch of DPSs and 1 healer in the queue, then the queue will be kind of long. But eventually, if there's not enough people in the queue, either the healer will get skipped and sit out the match while the game is built with 1 tank on each team and 3 DPSs, or if there's not enough DPS players in the queue, then the game might open with 1 team having a tank healer combo and the other team having only a tank and 3 DPS. Which of course is an advantage for the team that has 2 support classes, both the tank and the healer, but for sure the other team can also win, even though it will be an uphill battle. But based on my experience, the matchmaker definitely tries to balance the teams. And there's also a limit, so except for people leaving and then people rejoining, there will never be a game where you have 3 tanks on 1 team, for example. So the matchmaker tries to balance out the matches. But actually a cool idea, I think, that I mentioned in some other plays already, would be to have a system in place where maybe you can queue for multiple roles. So let's say you're a Juggernaut, you have a loadout for tank discipline and a loadout for the DPS discipline. Why don't they let you queue for war zones or even arenas as a tank and a DPS? And then the matchmaker could build the game depending on what roles are needed, right? Of course, that's, you know, probably not a small thing they can do in a day, but that would be a cool solution, I think. Okay, moving on, we need a rollback on the disparity in survivability between roles. But what is he actually saying? To be clear, I think it's important for there to be some disparity between tanks and non-tanks in terms of survivability. Yes, well, there are tanks, they should be a bit tanky, no? But what we have right now is far too much. I would agree, tanks are definitely too beefy if they go full dev, but I think the bigger issue, to be honest, is skank tanks doing way too much damage compared to how tanky they are with only using a shield offhand. And they actually buffed the DPS of all tanks in one of the previous patches, which I criticized already at the time. They simply do too much damage. If you have a Juggernaut tank that can do 15k DPS and also guard people and gets an extra defensive cooldown and a free 15% shield chance, yeah, that class probably is a little bit strong for Warzones right now. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Rework or remove healing terminals. The devs should seriously consider altering how the built-in healing terminals work. So he's talking about like the medpack thingies that spawn on all of the maps, right? Tanks are far more likely to make use of them in this meta because they're alive for a greater proportion of the match. Okay. But then again, if as a tank you're running to get the healing terminal, then you're not guarding anyone because you're probably running out of range. So unless you're literally playing on the healing terminal, which is usually not right next to the objectives, then you're not really doing your job as a tank. So I'm not sure that's actually an issue. Healing terminals also diminish the value of healers, making killing one less consequential because they provide such a massive amount of healing. Talking about the terminals, not the healers. Well, yes, but at the same time, if you're in a match where there are no healers, and you're on a class such as Marauder or PowerTech that don't have any self-sustain, any self-healing abilities, then, you know, playing for those healing terminals can actually be quite crucial. And sometimes it's also fun if you steal it away from someone in the last second and finish them off. So I actually think they provide some fun gameplay for people that don't play with a Premade healer. Yeah, so I'm against removing them. Healing terminals could be moved further away from objectives, like they are, for example, in Alderaan. I don't like this either. I think in Alderaan it's really annoying because you're just running to Narnia. I like the healing terminals more like they are in, let's say, Quash or maybe in SWTOR, where they are a little bit outside of the fight, but not so far that, you know, you're gone for 20 seconds. Because you have to run there and back again. So Alderaan healing thing is really just too far away in my opinion. Okay, but this guy wants to have them further away, longer respawn times and heal for less. I disagree with this. I think actually there should be more healing in the game, not less healing. So what I would do again is simply buff the HPS output of the healing classes and maybe in turn nerf some of the defensive cooldowns. Because for example Mercenary is simply too tanky, has too many cooldowns. Okay, nerfing healing terminals would also nerf stealth classes. Okay, that's a fair thing, but it always has been a thing that as a stealth class you can vanish out and get the healing terminal and then keep defending. I think that was in the game forever, as far as I remember. That is fine, even that they don't pull you out of stealth. No one really was complaining about that. Again, the more important issues, I think, first of all, is that it's impossible to find people in stealth these days unless, you know, you somehow get lucky, because the stealth detection is not high enough like in the past. And then again, you know, overpowered defensives and tacticals such as 2 cloaks is the bigger issue, not really the healing terminals. Guard is game breaking. Now here it gets interesting. The sheer power of Guard is likely one of the main causes of the seemingly deliberate role imbalance we have in the first place. So he's saying Guard is too powerful, it results in a near unkillable tank-healer duo, and often decides the outcome of a match. This is true if the other team has a tank and a healer, and you don't have either or maybe only a healer, then you need a huge DPS gap to still win that match. It's frustrating in general, but particularly excruciating for healers, when the other team is the only one that has a tank that knows how to guard it all. Well, that's the important point really, right? Like let's say both teams have a tank and one tank is very experienced and he keeps swapping the guard on, you know, whoever is low at the time, and the other guy just leaves the guard on, you know, his healer at all times, maybe, you know, doesn't even use it in the beginning, then, you know, you might as well not play tank. Because guard is so impactful, and a tank that knows what he's doing for sure will have like one of the biggest impacts on winning a match out of, you know, any of the disciplines in the game. In PvP, what guard actually does is, first of all, it gives you a 5% damage reduction if you have guard on you, and then it will take half of the pre-mitigation damage and redirect it to the tank, who then mitigates that damage through his additional defensive stats. So if you would do 100 damage to an unguarded target, if the target is guarded, first of all 5 damage are reduced, and then the main target will only take half of the remaining damage, and the other half will go to the tank, who has a chance to defend it, mitigate it, shield it, absorb it, and so on. And I would agree that in the current state of the game, guard mitigates too much damage and is simply too strong for the game in 2024. When the game first launched, guard I think was a really unique mechanic that I didn't really see in many other games. But you also have to remember that back then there were way less defensive cooldowns in the game. So when the game first came out, guard was already there, but there was no phase walk. Sorcerer did not have any force barrier. Mercenary didn't have reflect, and so on and so on. And of course there was no 2 cloaks tactical. So guard is still there and it's as powerful as it ever was. But then on top of that, all of the classes now have more and more powerful defensive cooldowns than when the game first launched. And they never balanced guard. So of course, if you have a tank that knows what he's doing and 1 or 2 healers, it's going to be really, really tough to kill them. So let's see what this guy says they should do to fix it. So the main idea would be to have it work like Star Wars shields. Okay, so I think he's talking about like space combat, where you have a fixed amount of health that can regenerate. At the same time, rework guard to interfere with some targeting. Not sure what he means with that. Should it reduce accuracy so you can miss? Or like a glancing blow or something? And transfer the tank's shield to the current friendly target instead of redirecting damage. Okay, let's keep reading on. Aha, and you take damage to the shield first before you take damage to the HP. Okay, so it basically works like in Galactic Starfighter. And then with guard, you can project that shield to a targeted ally. NPCs no longer target the guarded player. Well, that would be overpowered in PvE. And enemy players will no longer auto-target guarded players. What? Will no longer auto-target guarded players. I'm not sure what he actually means with that. Yeah, okay. So basically, instead of the damage reduction and damage transfer, he just wants to have it work as a shield, similar to how it works on like starships in Galactic Starfighter. And then as you damage to that shield, it kind of works as a second health pool, even though periodic damage still bypasses the shield. So, dots would still be good against tanks. So I'm not really sure how this would work. I guess you would need to make it that the shield regenerates only if you're not taking damage for a certain time. So I think this would be a really huge nerf to guard. I mean, obviously depending on how we tune the values, but as a tank, you kind of always want to be in combat. Maybe the shields could regenerate when you swap guard off a target, so you deactivate guard. I'm not sure, it's not really explained here from as far as I can see, but I think a better way would be, well, either just to nerf guard, so maybe instead of redirecting 50% of the damage, it could be something like 25 or 30%. That would already make guard way less impactful. Or you could make it so that this percentage that is redirected is tied to the defensive stats of the tank, right? So something like the absorb value, for example, could have a direct impact on the percentage of damage that you redirect. So if you're a full dev tank, your guard will be as powerful as it's now. But if you are a skank tank and you have, let's say 0 absorb rating, then your guard would maybe only redirect 10% of the damage or something. Because then you have a trade-off. You can choose to be a skank tank and do almost as much DPS as a full DPS player, but your guard is going to be weak and your healer is going to die. I think that would be another way to balance the system. Let's move on. Premades crush the queue into dust. Nice headline. Somehow the devs thought there was a good idea to let up to 8 players queue up together. Yes, no one asked for that, what the hell. Thus far, the devs have made it only take longer for larger groups to be matched up against smaller groups or, shockingly, individuals. I think he meant solo players. But that is worthless when the unchallenged premade makes up a quarter of the queue. If you spend a second to think about it, theoretically another premade should come in to take the throne, or if the game were in a better state, there should be enough premades that those players get matched against each others separately. Yes, exactly, that's what the game is trying to do. Sadly, that isn't happening right now. Okay, I mean, maybe not for 8-man player premades, but then again, I haven't really seen that many. From my experience playing in premades, the game definitely tries to match you against other premades. But for sure, I can understand if you're a solo player and you're playing against a premade that just keeps farming you at spawn, that's not very fun and causes players to quit. Okay, so yes, that's true. If there's a large premade in queue and there's only one premade in queue, you will wait for a long time because the game tries to find a fair match for you, and only after, 5 to 15 minutes. If it cannot, it will put the premade against a bunch of solo players or against a smaller premade plus a bunch of solos. Well, that's not fun, obviously. It's not fun for the solo players, obviously, but it's also not fun for the premade because, believe it or not, most premades want to play against other premades to prove that they're better. Unless you're a 14-year-old edgelord, it's not really fun to stomp solo players or new players as a veteran. But I think there's an aspect here that many people overlook, which is that if you are playing versus a premade, then it's very likely that you also have a premade on your team. But because the game doesn't show you who's in a premade, and unless those people will have the same guild tags or maybe some similar names, you will not really know who's in the premade. You can only guess from how the people are playing. So a lot of people think that they're playing solo versus premade, when actually they also have a premade on their team, but maybe they just don't know it, or this premade is just smaller or not as skilled, so they just get steamrolled and they think, oh, fucking premades, even though maybe on their team there was a premade as well. But I think what they should consider is to make it so that you can actually see who is a premade, because I think in many cases it feels like you are solo against premade, but in fact you also have a premade on your team, you simply don't know it. That being said, 8-man premades need to go. I have said this in the past as soon as they released it, as soon as it was in the patch notes. I said 8-man premates are a bad idea because it will mess up the matchmaking. The player base is simply not big enough. So what they should do is they should limit the premates back to how it was before. It's literally impossible for your average player to get invited to a premate with skilled PvPers. Well, no, I don't think this is the case. I think if you're a solo player and you're trying to find a group to play with, you can definitely do it. I mean, I even in the past tried to start a guild to help anyone that wanted to form their own premate or join a group do so. And the reality was that there weren't simply that many people interested in that. So, which for me is fine. If people prefer to play queue solo for Warzones, that's fine as well. But then you cannot complain that it's impossible to join a premate if you simply never try. And to this day, if someone whispers me and they ask if they can queue with our premate for a couple of games, I have never said no to anyone. Anyway, let's move on. But I think what he's saying here is very interesting. I shouldn't have to put together my own group just so I can stand a chance against the only other players in the queue. But importantly, at the same time, eliminating premates altogether is not a viable solution. And with that, I agree. Most people who complain about the premate issue are always saying you can simply introduce some form of solo queue so that players who want to queue solo only play against other players who queue solo, and players who queue premate only queue against other players who play premate. And of course that doesn't work because we already had the system in place. It was called group ranked and it died spectacularly. There are simply not enough players in the queue to make that work. Like, how would you match a 6-man premate versus a 4-man premate? That doesn't work. In that case, you need solo players on both sides to balance out the match. Even in arenas with 4 versus 4, the premate versus premate queue did not work, because you will pretty quickly see who is the better team, and then if there's only 2 teams in queue, the team that loses will pretty quickly stop queuing, because it's not fun to get farmed all evening long. Maybe you'll try once, twice, thrice, but then after the 4th loss in a row, typically people say, oh, this sucks, let's play something else. And if the skill gap is too big, like if you're not even close to winning a round, then this queue will die. And this is exactly what happened in group ranked. It was really hard for new teams to get in because of the large skill gap between the experienced teams and the beginner teams. And if there's not enough other beginner teams to match you with that have like a similar level, then those, beginner teams will simply stop queuing because they don't want to get farmed by the better premates, and the queue dies. And I would argue the system we have now is actually better, because even if the better premate queues into a warzone against another premate, which is maybe more beginner, then you still have 4 solo players on either team. And those 4 solo players can make the difference. So if we are queuing as 4 very experienced players, but we will have 4 solo players that, maybe play PvP for the first time and they're very new, they're almost not gonna contribute anything to the damage or healing of the match, right? And if the other team has maybe like a average premate, but 4 better solo players, then the other team is gonna win. And because of this RNG you have in Warzones with solo players being matched with premates, the game can actually be more interesting compared to if you would have a solo versus solo queue or a premate versus premate queue. And this guy is saying, well, of course, this is an MMO, so players must have the opportunity to play with their buddies. I definitely agree. For me, playing this game at the moment is pretty much only a social thing. I only keep playing it because I play it with my friends. Many of the friends I've met in the game are now IRL friends. And if there was no more premate queue, I would simply stop playing the game. And I know a lot of people feel the same way. But what is the solution? So he's saying the devs need to redefine what you're guaranteed to get when you queue up as a group. Grouping up for PvP should only be a guarantee that you and your buddies will get to be in the same match, but not necessarily on the same team. When I first read this, I thought, okay, what the fuck? But then when I thought about it, I thought it would actually be funny. Because some of the most fun matches I had in the past were the games when I played against some of my guildmates. Because it is very fun to, compete against your friends. Maybe pull them into fire while you're on Discord. And I think it definitely could be an option to balance out the matches a little bit more. So how could this work? It is reasonable for PvP for the line to be drawn at duo queuing, since that's what most other games do. Okay, so basically what it's saying is if you queue up as a 3-man premate, one of them will always be guaranteed to be on your team, and the other one will be matched to the opposing team, so you play against them. I think this is actually a good idea, but I would change it up slightly to be more fun. First of all, I wouldn't limit premates to groups of 2. I think they should limit it back to maximum group size of 4, how it was before the PvP revamp, because that was fine. And then do something like this, but a little bit differently, in the way that, let's say, we queue as a 4-man premate, and the other team has a 2-man premate, and then there's a bunch of solo players in both teams. what the game would do, randomly would take one player from our foreman premade and put it in the opposing team. So that basically both teams now have 3 premade players. I think that could be fun. I'm not sure it would be exactly balanced, because then still the other team has a 2-man player premade and one of our guys who is probably not going to be in the same Discord. So it's not as easy to communicate because, yeah, you can't use voice chat or something that's not in the game. But still, it would be one way to balance out the premade sizes, if people think that's actually the issue. And to be honest, I haven't really thought it through. I'm just kind of rambling now. But when I read this, I thought it was an interesting idea, because thinking about the games where we queue as premates, some of the most fun I had was playing against my own guildmates on the other team. And if there's a sort of RNG to it, so that not every game is the same, you know, maybe some game you will be in the premade team, you can farm your friends. In some other games, you're the unlucky one and you get RNG'd on the enemy team. I think that could make for some fun matches. I'm not sure I would enjoy it like all the time. I would still do it, of course, that if there's 2 foreman premates in the queue, those foreman premates could play against each other. And yes, it might lead to some toxic issues, like let's say you get matched in the opposite team, that player might leave. I definitely think that solution is not without problems, but I think it would be fun as an option, maybe something to try out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Okay, and the final thing he comments on is that there is poor visual clarity, because some of the visual effects are not impactful enough, so you cannot actually see what's happening in the game. So for example, taunting being almost invisible because there is no real animation on it. Well, I'm not sure this is true. For example, you can clearly see when a Juggernaut or a Guardian uses the AoE taunt. Sonic Missile on PowerTech I think is also pretty clear to see. I'm not sure I agree this is actually a problem. I think, sure, the animations could always be more clear in this game, and, you know, then you have to look at the buff icons, which is more often a thing for advanced players. But for me personally, I think a bigger issue is the performance in PvP, which is really bad. It's something they should finally work on and dedicate some resources to that, because, yeah, especially if you're playing on some of the newer maps, there are a lot of sorcerers in the game. You know, the FPS will drop to 15 or even lower. And when I stream or I record, my FPS is even worse than that, because the recording program will use some of the resources of my CPU and so on. So yeah, for me a bigger issue is the bad performance in this game, and not really the visuals or the clarity of the effects. Okay, so I think all in all, some takes that I don't really agree with in this article, but also some interesting suggestions that I think would be fun to try out. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Should they buff healers? Are tanks overpowered? Should they go back to foreman premates, or maybe even try the random queue thing that we talked about? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.